Hi, everyone. We will start in a few minutes. Thank you. Yeah. I think we have sufficient number of people who have logged into the webinar, and we can begin. So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of the IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Karan Kocher, and I am joining from IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, Germany. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to introduce IRENA and our webinar series as we always do in this format. IRENA is an intergovernmental organization with 170 member countries, and there are another 15 countries in their accession process. And our mandate is to support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future. And we aim to serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, and we're constantly looking for more ways to share those with you. And that's why we launched this webinar series. We have organized over 70 webinars on different topics, and you can check them all out on our IRENA events page. The link to that will be in the presentation slides. There are many longer deep dive webinars out there, but the aim of this webinar series is to keep it short and sweet. So these webinars will last approximately 30 minutes. We know that this is not enough to cover everything, but we do hope to give you enough information, and more than that, the sources of more in-depth information to help you explore the topic further. So today in the next 30 minutes, we will hear from Gayatri Prakash, who will share some insights from IRENA's latest toolkit titled Decarbonizing Hard-to-Abate Sectors with Renewables, Enablers and Recommendations. Please note that this is the first of the two webinar series we will host on this toolkit. For this session, we will focus on three industrial sectors, namely iron, steel, cement, and chemicals. The second webinar will take place on 11th November and will focus on the three transport sectors, namely shipping, aviation, and heavy-duty trucking. Sorry. But before I hand over the microphone to Gayatri, there are a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the IRENA events website. You're by default on mute, but if there are any questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A function. We will have a dedicated session at the end for the question answers. And without any further ado, let me welcome Gayatri to our Insights webinar series. Gayatri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karan. And hello, everyone. So as Karan already pointed out, that today's focus would be on the digital toolkit that IRENA launched 2 months ago on decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors, the enablers and key recommendations to support the transition. So this toolkit uses information collected as part of a project that IRENA carried out in collaboration with the Commission, funded by the European Union. The digital toolkit serves as a practical guide for policymakers, industry leaders, and other stakeholders to inform strategic planning and decision-making in decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors. So the toolkit indeed focuses on 6 hard-to-abate sectors and is structured in kind of 3 sections. So the first section that more or less introduces the decarbonization challenge in general, the 6 hard-to-abate sectors that we focus on this toolkit, IRENA's 5 decarbonization pathways for each of these sectors, and an enabling framework that could actually help in reducing the emissions in all these sectors. Section 2 focuses more on each of these 6 hard-to-abate sectors in terms of status of challenges that are existing in these sectors and proposed technological solutions in a short-term and long-term way to decarbonize these sectors. And the toolkit also maps close to 40 enablers, what we call it as enablers, with around 5 key enabling dimensions that can be achieved, that can be used to achieve the decarbonization in these sectors, which I will be presenting in this particular webinar. And finally, the toolkit also draws some conclusions to kind of provide a high-level perspective on decarbonization priorities, highlighting cross-cutting issues, commonalities in terms of challenges, enabling conditions, and solutions for different sectors. And we make around 11 recommendations for how countries can support the successful decarbonizations of these sectors. So if we move on to the next slide, we have made use of different channels to develop this project and toolkit. So IRENA has published a report in support of for the G7 Italy presidency last year. So we have indeed covered 5 of these sectors in detail, and basically highlighting the technological pathways and the key recommendations for the G7 countries to accelerate the transition of these sectors. The report is online, can be downloaded from IRENA's website, and we have conducted several expert discussions with experts on these topics. So one of which is through along the silence of IRENA's flagship event, IRENA Innovation Week in 2023, where we had deep dive sessions on some of the sectors and also a closed workshop on hard-to-abate sectors. We also organized 2 validation workshops early this year to validate the findings of this toolkit, where we had a very good participation of expert group from basically diverse stakeholders participating in these workshops, providing feedback to this toolkit. And IRENA also made use of other interesting workshops and discussions organized by industry associations. And we also presented some of the key findings of this toolkit, and we also leveraged these platforms to collect some inputs to complement the information that are presented in the toolkit. If you move to the next slide. So basically, we wanted to give you high-level insights from the toolkit, but we highly encourage you to go check for yourself, and where the information is quite overloaded. So in the limited time, I could only present high-level insights, but we'll be happy to receive questions and emails on this if you are to elaborate on any of these sectors through collaborations and so on. So as we know, limiting global temperature rise under 1.5 require all sectors of the economy to decarbonize. So for some sectors, such as electricity supply or passenger road vehicles, we have a clear path towards net zero dominated by electrification. But there are other sectors that are indeed hard to decarbonize due to their physical or market characteristics and so on. So this toolkit, as I said, it focuses on these sectors, which we could term it as hard to abate. So basically including the industrial subsectors such as cement, iron and steel, chemicals and petrochemicals. On the transport side, we have heavy-duty truck, shipping and aviation. Because these 6 sectors are roughly account for nearly 30% of the world's final energy consumption, and they are responsible for almost 27% of the total carbon emissions in 2023. But we also see progress in these sectors happening in the last few years. So there are like unprecedented social and political momentum gaining in these sectors, several targets and policies that are emerging on these fronts. There are also other progresses with respect to technological maturity, increasing competitiveness of renewables power especially, and other enabling technologies are actually bringing the decarbonization goal of these sectors more to reality. So we have tried to cluster them into 5 pathways, as you see in the next slide. So there are solutions that are indeed available to decarbonize these sectors. So our perspective on achieving net zero emissions recognizes that each of the sector is indeed different and will require different approaches. But we think most of the emission reduction will have to be achieved by a combination of these 5 pathways that are listed here, which primarily depend on renewables and energy efficiency. So it is quite clear as we move to the next slide that renewables will play a central role in decarbonizing all these hard-to-abate sectors. So before I want to present on these findings, I just want to talk a little bit about this simple yet complicated graph. Here, as you see, the 6 sectors that I already listed and these 5 technological pathways. The increasing circle size indicates higher relevance to the decarbonization effort of each sector. So basically, larger the circle is, greater the relevance it is for the sector, and vice versa with respect to the size. The extent to which the circle is filled with the color, the concentration of the color, indicates the technology readiness. So a fully filled circle do indicate a technology is readily available for deployment, whereas an empty circle do indicate a lack of readiness. So there needs to be a lot of innovation and R&D support that's needed to bring this technology to commercialization stage. And a line do indicate that it is neither negligible or of no relevance to the sector. So with all these solutions, as I said, like renewables will be key in all these sectors, of which we see an increasing role for direct electrification, so use of clean electricity in LO, with important contributions in multiple applications. Some of these solutions may have already reached or close to technological maturity. So specifically on industrial sector side, we see solutions include the use of electric arc furnaces for steel making, which will become more relevant and prominent as the share of recycled steel increases in the coming decades. We also see the role of heat pumps for low to medium temperature heating in industry, and also other applications of direct electrification, which will have a greater potential in the future, but still needs further development. Examples to include electric crackers to produce primary chemicals or electrolysis of iron ore in the steel industry. Next to electrification, we see bioenergy and synthetic fuels also playing a critical and complementary role. So here it's quite important on ensuring the sustainability aspects of bioenergy. So scaling up sustainable and low carbon bioenergy solution is not only key to decarbonizing the shipping and aviation sectors, but they are also critical to the provision of feedstocks for the chemicals and as a potential carbon source for synthetic fuels. Indirect electrification, which is another shade of darker green, where the production of renewable hydrogen is also set to play an important role, especially in these sectors, what we are going to discuss today. So renewable hydrogen can do this as a reductant in the production of iron in primary steel production or as a feedstock in the chemical industries. And we see that all these pathways will have to be complemented by continuous energy efficiency improvements in the industrial side, also in the other transportation sectors. The application of principles of circular economy is quite important. And emissions can also be reduced through application of carbon capture, utilization and removal measures, especially in the case of cement, provided these technologies achieve the necessary improvements in performance and economics to make them technically scalable and economically viable. So if you move to the next slide, we see that technology is quite important to fully transition these sectors, but we also see that the innovation has to be extended beyond technology. So here is where we have applied IRENA's systemic innovation approach. So looking at innovation beyond technology, but also including holistic enablers in the area of policy and regulation, physical digital infrastructure, system operational measures, new market designs, innovative business models, or financing instruments, supply chain, skills, capacity development, stakeholder engagement, and wider international collaboration. So this IRENA's enabling framework groups these innovations into these 5 enabling dimensions in order to accelerate the efforts in the hard-to-abate sectors. So to translate these dimensions into actionable insights, so we have provided a mapping in the toolkit that organizes the necessary actions and initiatives into enablers, what we call it as enablers. So this taxonomy serves as a structured guide, categorizing and clarifying the diverse approaches that are required to fulfill sector-specific needs. While the first set of the 4 enablers across these policies to supply chain are very specific, but we think the last international collaboration is quite cross-cutting and highlights opportunities for countries and regions to cooperate beyond borders on these enabling activities. So just to delve a bit deeper on these dimensions, if we move to the next slide, we will start with the policy and regulation dimension. For example, we have identified around 11 enablers that are specific for energy-intensive industries. So enablers do here encompass sector-specific targets and roadmaps to carbon pricing mechanisms with sufficiently high and widespread carbon pricing that are crucial for these sectors, economic supportive measures, including subsidies, tax credits, and emerging models on this front, such as carbon contracts of difference. We also include some of the demand stimulation policies from green public procurement, mandates and quotas for green commodities and fuels, and other regulatory frameworks. And finally, some public support for R&D. Just to give one example within these enablers, we try to focus only on one example, but of course, in the toolkit, you will have a hyperlink for each of these enablers with more details and examples. So we move to the next slide. I would just give one example within these policy and regulation, some of the enablers that I listed. Green public procurement, which is of high relevance to the industrial sectors. So public procurement, we know, accounts for almost a quarter of the global steel demand, for example. But only a few of the green public procurement schemes currently include steel products. And California is one of the jurisdictions where we see a mandatory policy on this front that considers the steel emissions. But we also see a lot of improvements that are happening, especially with respect to UNIDO's IDDI's Green Public Procurement Pledge, where countries like Austria, Canada, Germany, Japan, UAE, and United Kingdom, along with US, have committed for low emission procurement targets within a set timeline. So here we think the prioritizing green steel and cement in general in all the public projects will create a huge demand and reduce financial risk for producers. The private sector, in the case of chemicals, we see that private sector do have a high share of direct consumption than the public sector, but governments can still create initial markets for chemicals, particularly ammonia in the form of fertilizers, through large-scale procurement and supply planning. So some of the examples I could pick up from the toolkit are being listed here, but of course, if you go online, you will see much more examples tracking the progress on this front. The next slide focuses on technologies, infrastructure, and system operation. So here the emphasis is placed not solely on the technological solutions and the readiness level, but more on the enablers for forward-looking planning, modernizing infrastructures, including the digital tools and processes and wide system operational measures, expanding the supportive infrastructure on land and sea to facilitate the development, transmission, distribution, storage, and consumption of renewables. So within this technologies and infrastructure, just to give one example on the next slide, we picked up the direct use of clean electricity, for instance. I did discuss about this topic in the initial slides where we see a prominent role of electrification in some of the sectors, and we see more and more progress happening in the steel and chemical sector with the completion of some of the demonstration plants as already listed here in the slide. Electrifying cement kilns at high temperature is quite challenging at the moment. There are a few pilot projects that are exploring use of high temperature electric plasma or concentrated solar thermal, but these solutions are still in the experimental stage and requires much more support, and there are uncertain economics and potential for scaling on this front. So if we move to the next dimension on market conditions, businesses, and finance, we have identified around 7 enablers that could be applied on this front, more from the private sector angle and financial community. So this dimension in general focuses on various strategies, emerging business models, innovative financing instruments, green procurement deals, and partnerships for different stakeholders to establish a market for green commodities and fuels. They also try to address the challenges the companies face in scaling some breakthrough technologies, particularly in financing the first of kind facilities. and also explore some of the solutions for green commodity producers to maintain the competitiveness in the global market. So here, just to pick one example on the next slide, we have used the offtake agreements and long-term contracts. So the offtake long-term contracts, so which is a prominent example for industries where we see, for example, the case of steel, where we see global steel players are already taking some enough steps to decarbonize their production lines and forming partnerships to pool demand for green steel. So as of December, just to give few numbers, we have observed approximately 140 offtake agreements for low carbon steel has been signed, especially with the automotive sector and consumer goods and equipment manufacturers taking the lead. Despite this progress, we still feel the volume of these private sector commitments are way negligible, still denotes a negligible share of today's overall steel demand. Similarly, producers also have signed several offtake agreements for low emission chemicals or feedstocks to produce some of the chemicals through supply agreements and procurement tenders. So here I listed few examples that are happening in multiple sectors. So the last dimension on the supply chain in the next slide covers some of the enablers and measures to create, for instance, resilient and sustainable supply chains. So here, taking into account the availability and trade of critical minerals, resource constraints, social and environmental impacts, also focusing a bit more broader on associated training and capacity building programs to acquire the right skills, knowledge exchanges and expertise to drive and sustain the energy transition, especially in the emerging and developing markets. Raising awareness, also engaging wider stakeholders, including government, industry, and civil society. So basically communities and individuals, among others. So within this, we have chose one example of knowledge exchange, as we see in the next slide. So here the focus was more on what are the, how to accelerate the transition. It's important to exchange knowledge on these technologies, financing options, best practices for greening the industry. So here, such an effort is important and crucial, as I said, for emerging and developing markets and regions. There are several organizations that are establishing several knowledge platforms to promote this transfer and build new capacities and skills on these critical topics. And here I have listed some of the noted examples like Climate Club, who are actively involved in this space through multiple work streams. And also they have launched their financing toolkit recently. And in partner with UNIDO, the global matchmaking platform serves also as a good example on how it's helping different countries on the industrial decarbonization front. And we have captured much more in the sector-specific examples in the toolkit, and we encourage you to check it out online. Finally, the last slide, we see focus on international collaborations. So as I said, this hinges on several of these enablers that we have been listed already, and it's as we know, the decarbonizing these sectors is a multilateral challenge. So working towards mutually beneficial partnerships will be critical if you are to accelerate the adoption of these technologies and decarbonize the supply chains for industrial commodities. So here I have listed some of the prominent examples, but from IRENA side, we are hosting the Alliance for Industry Decarbonization with quite some active participation of private sector, but also some public sector with our member states, where we facilitate some of the important discussions to bridge the gap and enhance the decarbonization efforts of these sectors. Finally, if we move to the last slide, here based on all these assessments and mapping and tracking the progress of each of these enablers across the sectors, we kind of realized that there are several enabling conditions that needs to be put in place to decarbonize these sectors. So they require quite some decisive action by governments, but also from the private sector. And these conditions do have an implication in terms of national and international policy and regulatory environments, technology, infrastructure planning, the way the global commodity markets work, and the international supply chains and need for innovative business models. So all in all, I want to conclude saying in this context of global uncertainties and supply chain vulnerabilities that we are facing now, governments are indeed aiming to balance the decarbonization goals with priorities for competitiveness, resilience, and security. But however, these objectives are not just specific to hard-to-abate sectors, but they are quite important in broader term for the energy sector or beyond that. And investing in clean technologies and infrastructure has the potential to build new industries and also reduce reliance on fossil fuel imports. So aligning the decarbonization goals with national interests is not just an important avenue to reaffirm a commitment to decarbonizing the economy, but we also see it as a strategic opportunity for economic and sustainable growth. Thank you, and I'll give back to you, Karen.
Thanks, Gayatri, for the presentation. We have received some questions in the Q&A chat box. I think some are directed towards the transport sector. I would repeat that there is a similar webinar for the three transport sectors on the 11th of November, and we will consider that question and try to include that in the presentation. I think there are two questions that we can answer. I can take one and you can take one, maybe. Gayatri. So the first question or one of the questions that we have received is, how can community engagement serve as a tool towards supply? Maybe let me take this one. So industries are built around communities. These communities support these industries. And when industries go through transformation, that impacts the communities there. So in the toolkit, the iron and steel sector has a very good example of how in the UK, and especially in the retirement of the blast furnaces at one of its locations, they're actively engaging the community to make sure that they're supported in their transition. And I would encourage you to look at the toolkit to learn a bit more about how community engagement helps in the transition. And maybe one more question for you, Gayatri. So this is there in the toolkit, are there any quantification of the potential for any of the or each of the enablers available, or is it more of a qualitative assessment?
Thank you, Karen. So we have done a detailed qualitative assessment, to be honest, on these enablers and how important it is for each of the sectors, and we have identified this mapping. But indeed, the quantitative side is each of these, not that all these enablers could be quantified, right? Like most of these enablers have to be discussed qualitatively, but with the long-term impacts in terms of gains that you see on the monetary terms or on other environmental terms. But we do consider some of the enablers are already a part of IRENA's project scenario development exercise that we carry out as part of World Energy Transition's Outlook, where we look into how these technological solutions play a role in towards 2030 and 2050 at a global, regional, and country level. And we look into different indicators and how these technologies will evolve in the global picture, but also at a regional and country level picture. So that's something we are doing as part of the scenario exercise, but we haven't done anything specific here on the quantitative element. But that's something we might consider in the future. But indeed, there are other IRENA's work, as I already touched upon, IRENA's World Energy Transition's Outlook, but also there are innovation outlooks that we have done for some of the options like ammonia, methanol, where we did look into some of the aspects like cost, evolving towards future, but also the potential and which sectors will play a key role and so on. So IRENA do have some deep dives on some of these enablers, both qualitative and quantitative. But here in this toolkit, we have tried to bring insights from our own work, research, and also interactions with various stakeholders out there.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gayatri. I see there are many more questions that are left to answer. And I would encourage maybe that you guys could write to us or write to me and I can connect you to Gayatri. My email ID is kkocher@irena.org. That's KOCHHAR @irena.org. And we would be happy to receive your questions and your feedback that would inform our future work. Unfortunately, our time is up for today. I would like to thank Gayatri for her time and for sharing the knowledge. I would also like to thank everyone for joining us today, especially for the questions also. We learned a lot and I hope you learned something as well. The recording and the slides will be posted on the IRENA events page. We will, before we leave, I would like to highlight that we have 2 more IRENA Insights webinars that we still plan to have, one on the transport sector, which I mentioned, and the other one is on the potential of green hydrogen and the derivative commodity trade that will happen on the 25th of November. And with that, I wish you a good rest of the day and hope to see you soon for the next webinars. Thank you.